Summer Again premieres 8:35 Tuesday on ABC.
Tonight, the tiny fishing nations of the Pacific become entangled in the superpower's net. And after a week of political ghosts, Malcolm Fraser speaks on the Liberal leadership, the Soviet threat, and Mr. Justice Murphy.
He should have stood down, in my view, before he was committed for trial. Because I do not believe you can have a a judge of the High Court, subject to the kind of public debate and public argument that Mr. Justice Murphy has been subject to.
The thoughts of Malcolm later in the programme. Thanks for joining us. And you can be sure that the former Prime Minister has some pretty strong views on our first story tonight. This is the beautiful island state of Kiribati, some 5,000 kilometres out in the Pacific. Mr. Fraser says it's in grave danger of becoming a Soviet military base. His claim is based on the fact that Kiribati has just negotiated a fishing agreement with the Soviet Union. North and east of Australia stretches the richest tuna ground in the world, rich enough to keep some Pacific states afloat. Nations like Samoa, the Solomons, and the awkwardly spelt Kiribati. Such places are not the mere dots in the ocean they might appear. Each is ringed by a narrow band of territorial water, and since the late 70s by a much wider economic zone, embracing all marine resources, like tuna, for 200 miles. The United States, alone in the world community, disputes the ownership of fish within this wider economic zone. Marauding American trawler fleets are steaming off with catches worth hundreds of millions of dollars each year, leaving the islanders' humble craft struggling in their wake. It's provided a perfect opportunity for the Soviet Union to move in, and now the Pacific states are being squeezed between the competing interests of the superpowers. Tuna Sandwich is reported by David Marr.
Most of the tuna caught in the world is eaten in the United States, and this is what they want: skipjack and yellowfin. And they want it canned, and they want it for lunch. It's not apple pie that makes Americans American any longer, it's the tuna sandwich. Yet everything America takes from these waters is taken illegally. Japan, Korea, and Taiwan all agree that these fish belong to these islands. They fish and pay license fees. The Americans just fish.
They came to the Western Pacific 4 years ago. American tuna boats called Pasainas, built to scoop fish out of the sea hundreds of tons at a time. That American fleet now fishes when it likes and where it likes in the Pacific. It ignores island law and international law. The islands see this as theft of their single greatest resource, tuna. Island police could see the boats, but not catch them. But a year ago, a West Australian shipyard lent the Solomons a patrol boat. As a sales gambit, it turned out a spectacular success. While running under a local crew, the boat heard that an American Pasaina, the Jeanette Diana, had been sighted fishing in Solomon's waters.
The Commissioner of Police ordered us to sail direct to the scenes. Early in the morning, we saw a helicopter flew over us. Then the Pasaina boat started to steam away for full speed. So we started to chase. We got chased at about 6:15 in that morning. We chased about an hour. When we came alongside Lieutenant Diana, we communicate each other on the VHF. Then we identify ourselves on the captain. Then we ask him politely, we say, we are the Royal Solomon Island Police Force. Then we'd like you to stop. He said, no, I cannot stop. I make my way to Papua New Guinea. Then we fire 3 shots across his bow. Then at the same time, he automatically stopped. Then we go alongside, and then I send my boarding party to board the boat.
What would you have done if he hadn't stopped?
If he don't stop, I think that will be a big problem.
In fact, Parda had to threaten to shoot the tanks of the helicopter before Captain Jose Finetti stopped the Jeanette Diana. The boat was brought to the Solomons' capital, Honiara. Captain Finetti and the crew were detained in a city hotel for a month while the Solomons worked out what they'd done. A mouse had roared. The new law of the sea gives the islands immense tuna resources. The problem is defending them. Solomons Police have old Australian 303s and 1 patrol boat to back its claim to the tuna against the only country on earth to dispute it, the United States.
We're the fishermen. We have to make a living. And that's where the differences are. The United States does not recognize any nation's claim to manage or conserve tuna beyond 12 miles.
Finetti and his crew came to trial here in the Solomons High Court, which had one central question to decide. Was the Jeanette Diana fishing? Later, Finetti would call this a kangaroo court, but it could hardly have been more traditional, almost British. The acting Chief Justice was a young Englishman. Finetti himself was defended by a Sydney barrister, and key evidence was given by an English fisheries officer who found fresh fish in the Jeanette Diana's nets. Just how fresh it was demonstrated by a Japanese fishing master, a connoisseur of sashimi, who took fish from the Jeanette Diana's nets and ate it raw. Yet the captain, Finetti, claimed that he hadn't been fishing for 5 or 6 days, not since he entered Solomon Islands waters. The judge didn't believe him. By the end of the case, the judge didn't believe Finetti on any of the matters in dispute. He found Finetti had been fishing.
The vessel was not fishing. There was no evidence at all that there was any fishing by that vessel during the day.
There was fish in the net which was still edible.
Well, we can get into dispute on that.
Well, it was eaten.
Well, I think that we're in a very speculative area and a very interesting one, but I think it's an area where we get fisheries scientists involved as to whether you can determine from a piece of fish whether it was caught within the last 5 days or not.
Would you eat fish that had been lying for 5 days on the deck of a Pasena?
Well, obviously the answer would be no, but is that the testimony?
The court found it compelling testimony. I have no doubt, the judge said, that Captain Finetti knew exactly what he was doing. I have no doubt he thought the risk of being caught was minimal. The motive was financial gain. The punishment should be accordingly. The judge fined Finetti $12,000, the owners of the boat $60,000, and the Jeanette Diana, with all its equipment, including the helicopter, was forfeit to the Solomon Islands. The price of buying that back was eventually set at a further $770,000. The judge hoped this would deter what he called widespread illegal fishing in the Solomons, but whether it did is extremely doubtful, because every cent of that penalty was paid by the United States government. It was obliged to do so under law passed by Congress. The same law allows the fines to be recouped from any foreign aid allocated to the Solomons. And Congress obliged the United States government to embargo all Solomons fish and fish products. The embargo wasn't lifted until the Solomons joined negotiations to allow American boats to fish its waters in future. The Solomons were under embargo for 10 months after the capture of the Jeanette Diana. It cost millions more than the fines it provoked. This extraordinary legislation, which effectively encourages United States citizens to break international law and punish other nations for following it, is the result of the enormous influence in Washington of the tuna industry and its lobby, the American Tuna Boat Association.
I think the American ATA is a very strong lobbyist in the American government. I found out when negotiating the Janetta Diana issue. Because whereas the American government can see the logic and rationale behind the presentation of my case, they always refer to the strength of the American Tuna Boat Association lobby.
In Washington, dolphins have more clout than Pacific Islanders. Since the late 1970s, conservationists have forced Pacenas in the old fishing grounds between California and Chile to release all the dolphins once caught and killed in the nets. That costs time and money. The fleet split. Between 40 and 50 of the giant boats headed west into the Pacific and made their headquarters here in American Samoa. This is America. Each year it celebrates the day the United States annexed it, a sort of Dependence Day. The harbour the United States Navy wanted then is now the headquarters of both the American tuna fleet and its tuna canneries. Labour is cheap in Samoa. The canneries of San Diego shut down and reopened here. They're the biggest taxpayer on the island now, and after the government, the biggest employer.
No matter how many millions it costs to build and run one of these Pacenas, they're in fact worth very little unless they have a contract to sell their fish to one of the two canneries here in the harbour, Starkist and Van Camp. For Pacific Island nations wanting to make a go of their own tuna industries, they too must deal with these two canneries.
The canneries set the price, and the price has been forced down sharply. Evidence of that is tied up at the end of Pango Pango Harbour. Some of the boats in this graveyard of Pacenas were brand new before the banks impounded them. The low price of fish and the high price of money and petrol are a powerful encouragement for the Pacena fleet to seek the biggest catch for the least cost anywhere.
This is the American Queen Whiskey Yankee Zulu 6929 calling Harbor Master.
This is Harbor Master. Go ahead, Captain Lewis.
Roger, this is the American Queen asking permission to sail her.
Permission granted, Captain Lewis.
A couple of bad trips could ruin Captain Luz. His boat is expensive to run. The tanks of the American Queen hold 250,000 gallons of fuel at $1 a gallon.
We can catch up to 300 ton a day, but the average haul is between 40 and 60 ton. We look for logs or debris in the water. The debris attracts the bait, and the bait attracts the fish.
In the tanks of supercooled brine below, Luz stows between 1,000 and 1,100 tons of fish each trip. He admits in a good year to 5 trips. Total value of the catch, about $4 million.
Okay, we start here from Samoa, go northwest, and we go by Tuvalu Islands, and continue northwest, and then north of Santa Cruz Islands, which belongs to the Solomon Islands, up to the zero line, and then go west and fish up to the 139 west. We normally fish 5 north, 5 south of the equator.
Like many of the Pacena skippers, Luz is a Portuguese-American. He once worked on the Jeanette Diana. He told us if he'd been there that day in the Solomons, I would have talked them out of it.
We have a chart on the vessel here where we can and where we can't fish.
And Kiribati, what's the status there?
Any of the islands belonging to the Gilberts or the Marshalls, we can fish.
You can fish those?
We can fish.
Yeah. That's not how Kiribati and the rest of the world sees it. Once the Pacific states declared their economic and fishing zones, only slivers of high sea remained. Without poaching in the zones, the American fleet could not survive. The United States solution was simple. It declared that it would not recognize the zones applied to highly migratory fish. That meant one species of migratory fish only, tuna.
The tunas respect no lines. Therefore, we feel in economic terms, we have to therefore take advantage of these behavior and biological facts regarding the tuna to stay in business economically. This is a tough world. Let's say you and I decide we are going to establish a railroad from San Diego to Boston. Now, I don't know what the situation, it might be Perth to Sydney. But the United States are a number of states, as you know, continental United States. So if we were going to let that railroad be regulated by each and every state in the way that they wanted, we would have a lot of difficulty running that railroad.
But these are sovereign states. They can't be compared to the states of the United States.
I'm trying to give you an example. Do we recognize the competence and the justification for those who live on Pitcairn Island? I don't want to, but they have a very large 200-mile zone. Now, they could claim all ownership. You could have some nations, therefore, in a position under that claim, it's recognized, to totally obstruct any efforts to effectively conserve or manage or to effectively engage in that fishery economically.
Pitcairn is big, but nothing to Kiribati. Zones spread out from every atoll and reef as wide as Australia. 58,000 people live in 3.5 million square kilometres of ocean and tuna. But Kiribati is one of the poorest nations on earth. Too poor to run a patrol boat, to have embassies, even to belong to the United Nations. Dirt poor, you might say, but there's no soil here, just sand and crushed coral. If the outside world remembers this pattern of islands at all, it knows them as the Gilberts. Britain found phosphate here and made them a colony. It ran out and she gave them independence. Export income dropped that year, 1980, from $21 million to $2.3 million. Kiribati now has almost nothing but fish. Some of the American boats paid license fees for a few years to some of the islands. Kiribati was one. The amount of money was tiny, about $1 million. The Pasenas tried to force the price down a further 50%. That was unacceptable. They're paying nothing now, but still fishing.
We have nothing against America, but I think I'm not sure if they know of these normal human courtesies that are very important, even to a very small island like Kiribati. The government is determined to make it on its own, to be able to run its own affairs on its own resources. Without that, it's very hard to claim that we are independent, and without that, we don't think that we can regard ourselves as obtaining self-respect. And that word is very important to Kiribati, at least very important to me. We have a small fishing fleet, about 4 of them. While they are beginning to make money, it's very small in relation to the requirement of the nation, you see. If we cannot get the best out of resource, life for the country is not going to be very easy.
These pole and line tuna boats are tiny compared to the Pasenas. Izzy Luz each year on the American Queen catches more than the whole of the Kiribati fleet. Local pole and line fleets compete with the huge American Pasenas throughout the islands. The local catch suffers. Local fishermen can do nothing about it, even in American Samoa.
We're keeping an eye on them. We're trying to keep them away from the areas where the local fishermen fish.
How are you going to do that?
Well, by talking to them and trying to make them respect our own fishing regulations and fishing zones that we have established for our own local government.
And how are you going to make them respect those zones?
Well, really we can't. We are merely appealing to their sense of fairness and, you know, and trying to help our fishermen out, our local fishermen.
Away from American waters, American boats claim to recognize one rule: to stay outside the 12-mile territorial sea. But they don't. On the Kiribati island of Anoto, in January 1985, the Carol Linda brushed with fame. She ran aground.
Remember that very well because it was Super Bowl time in the United States, and that was the night I received the call.
They went aground. We tried to win and arrest them, but we were very slow.
An early judgment had to be made as to, once the vessel was afloat, to take it to a safe harbor for inspection, and that's what was done.
From here, they went to the marshals, and we gathered through the grapevine that some of the groups were boasting that they were being fishing and they were not caught. You know, our only reaction are the natural ones, you see, that we feel we're being insulted in a real way.
Well, I don't know of any complaint that's been filed by Kiribati.
We sent a protest note to the Americans, and they came back that they have not been fishing. But I mean, coming all the way from America and just to transiting in that part of our country, we will be very naive to believe they have not been fishing.
Frankly, it was a tremendous feat of seamanship that the vessel was saved.
We're not talking about the 200 miles, we are talking about the territorial waters, which I think it's a prohibited place to any country, you see.
When you hit land like that, clearly, and as it was found to be so, it was a gross navigational error. And it's just one of those things that happen at sea.
We intend to take the matter to court, and we want a decision on that by the court, and we hope the Americans will be able to come to face charges, but if they don't, we're still going to carry on with it in their absence.
Well, then it has a problem with jurisdiction, and that is that it may be able to try the individuals of the vessel in absentia. I don't know at the present time just what their action is, but we were very fortunate to save that vessel, very fortunate that no lives were lost.
After a quick refit, the Carol Linda fished its way west from the Marshalls into the Federated States of Micronesia. Last heard of, the Carol Linda was heading for the Solomons in pursuit of tuna, chicken of the sea. Above a Wellington bank last month, the Pacific Islands met to try to resolve their conflict with the United States. Talks have been continuing since the confiscation of the Jeanette Diana. The United States will not concede island ownership of the tuna, but is offering a management fee to allow American purseaners to fish for it. In the end, the American tuna lobby will decide what's acceptable to Washington. United States Fishing Ambassador Ed Wolfe, himself a former tuna lobbyist, considered the negotiations too sensitive to allow Four Corners an interview.
United States government statement to ABC TV, Sydney, Australia. The United States is involved with 15 Pacific Island states in an effort to negotiate a multilateral tuna agreement. The meetings in Wellington, New Zealand this week are the fourth round of talks, which began in Suva, Fiji in September 1984. The negotiations are designed to create a regional licensing regime which would allow U.S. tuna vessels to fish in the South Pacific according to the terms and conditions agreeable to the United States and the Pacific Island states. The conclusion of such a fisheries agreement will further the good relations which presently exists between the United States and the nations of the South Pacific.
But relations are not fine. It's going to be a year before there's a treaty to put before the United States Senate, and months more at the very least before it becomes law. But the fishing, meanwhile, goes on. Would you seize an American Pasena boat if you found one out there?
Yes, yes, we will. We'll continue to do that without any formal agreement entered into between Solomon Islands and an American government or the American Tuna Boat Association.
Despite the price you might pay for that?
Despite what we have experienced, we will continue to uphold our national sovereignty, yes.
Without cash from the American tuna boats, President Tabai of Kiribati began negotiating in February this year to sell fishing licenses to the Soviet Union. It caused a diplomatic panic. The Russians have been trying to get such a deal for years. Fiji, Vanuatu and Tuvalu have turned the Soviets down. Tabai is about to do business. His budget is so tiny that the proposed Russian fee of $2.4 million will boost national income by nearly a fifth.
We talk to the Russians because they are interested in fishing and we are interested to earn the income, and we don't see anything intrinsically wrong with that. I'm into the controversy about our talks with the Russians, and I have not seen one single good reason why we should not continue our talks with the Russians.
The West found many. Australia told Kiribati it would be better off having nothing to do with the Russians.
I think the more important thing, rather than engaging in the emotional polemics of Cold War rhetoric, is to talk about the potential for great power instability developing because of competitive presences, and that potential is already evident in Southeast Asia because of the Russian build-up in Cam Bay and Da Nang. Not serious at this stage, but it has the potential for being something serious. We wouldn't care for that sort of thing to start in the South Pacific, and I can assure you that the island states of the South Pacific wouldn't care for it to happen either.
Kiribati originally spoke of letting the Russians use its ports, just as the Russians do in New Zealand, Singapore and Japan, for a fee. Australia has offered the same deal in the past. But after an intense diplomatic effort spearheaded by Australia, President Tabai dropped the offer.
We told them that we recognised that if they determined that they wanted to enter into a commercial deal with the Soviet Union, that was their sovereign right, but that we would prefer, as we recognise they aimed at ensuring that the Soviets didn't get any land facilities, permanent land facilities in Kiribati. That's as far as we went. And we merely conveyed our attitude on this. We didn't lecture them or seek to set down guidelines.
What worries Australia about the Russians having a permanent base on Kiribati?
They had a permanent land-based facility, the number of prospects for them. They could expand it in various ways. They could set it in place. Electronics intercept capabilities to intercept communications in the region. There is evidence that their fishing fleets in fact engage on activity which has a very direct military relationship. The oceanographic work certainly is more related to naval needs and fishing needs in many instances. Some of their vessels, we suspect, their major vessels allegedly associated with fishing fleets, have electronics intercept functions too.
If the Russians intend to do their spying, they can do their spying even without giving them a fishing license within our trial mouth.
So they're free to spy, but they need a license to fish.
Well, I'm not saying they are free to spy, but I'm saying that, you know, if they want to spy, they can do it under international law because they can pass through the waters. And if I may say so, within our 12 months, they haven't got anything to spy on. Honest, you know, we haven't got any secret for them to spy on, you see. We haven't got anything of importance that they want to see or to learn about. More likely, they want to spy on Australia. And I say this, not out of disrespect to our friends, and I must say again, we intend to maintain our friendship, but please, let us make our own decision on the one we consider to be our national interest. Because I know, even though they are very friendly to us, the Americans, the British, the New Zealand, the Australian, everybody, I know that in the final analysis, we are the only ones who care about our national interest, and the Australians and New Zealand don't know what our national interests are.
Who do you think you could trust more, the Russians or the American Tuna Boat Association?
Well, that's a hard question, but I'm not. I don't think it's a question of trusting one or the other. It's a question in our view now of whether we can get, you know, the income that we need most.
Americans make mistakes about local conditions. Here on Kiribati, where in the last war they fought the first amphibious landing to dislodge the Japanese, someone got the tides wrong and walked the Marines across the reef and into the guns.
Now the Americans are mounting another battle in the islands, this time to keep the Russians out. And they're doing it when their own prestige is at rock bottom because of the activities of the American Tuna Boat Association. When people in the islands talk about the Americans, they express rage, but not incomprehension. They say, this is the way the Americans operate.
Well, we have a livelihood. We believe we are following our laws, and we hope that our government will understand. We hope the governments will understand our position, and we hope there'll be enough tuna for everyone.
It's not hard to see why even the US State Department is somewhat embarrassed by the antics of the American Tuna Boat Association. But as I mentioned before David Marr's report, much more to be feared are the Soviet fishermen. At least that's the view of one Western leader who's been beating the old communist can well and truly. His name is Malcolm Fraser. He says the Soviets will soon talk their way into a supply depot on Kiribati. Then, before we know it, that will become a naval facility. And in no time at all, there'll be an airbase as well. Mr. Fraser unveiled this alarming scenario in a recent speech in Washington, one of his many overseas trips since losing office. That happened some 30 months ago now, but the former Prime Minister must have felt very much at home when he returned from his latest trip to New Zealand to find such familiar names as Cairns, Morosi, Combe and Murphy dominating the headlines. As if that wasn't enough political déjà vu, the Liberal leadership was also back in the news. So there was plenty to talk about when I called on Malcolm Fraser this morning, back at Nareen, his fabled stud property in the rich Western District of Victoria. Mr. Fraser, let's start by talking about Kiribati, if we may, please. Why are you so sceptical about the Soviet Union's intention in Kiribati?
You've only got to look and see what they've done in other places, in the Caribbean, parts of the Indian Ocean, where something starts as a simple economic facility, and then it turns into over time, into a military facility in a way that's very destabilizing.
But that would involve the acquiescence of the local country,
sure. Ah, yes. But you see, the reason that no South Pacific country wants an arrangement with the Soviet Union. They're not communist in that sense. They're very poor, very fragile states. $2 million or $3 million a year for fisheries rights probably adds very significantly, not probably does, add very significantly to their national income. So it's a matter of money. And once they get a foothold in, then the Soviet Union says, well, now we need to extend our facilities, and it always sounds reasonable. We need some refueling facilities for ships, some repair facilities, and then a landing field maybe, and then
Still a fair mental leap, though, to get to a naval facility and an airbase.
But you don't have to make the mental leap. It's a matter of fact. I was speaking to Prime Minister Seaga of Jamaica just 2 months ago. He said in the Caribbean, this is how it happens. You start off with an economic facility, and then with the economic power that gives the Soviet Union over a very small and fragile state, it becomes a military facility. And, you know, it's the same pattern. It's not Fraser making a hypothesis. It's Fraser talking about what has happened in other places and saying, now, it's sad that it's starting to happen in the Pacific.
We are talking about a fishing agreement, of course, between the two of us.
Yes, that's right.
I wonder if that approach isn't in danger of being a little patronising, though, for us to talk about the islands not being able to accept it when we're perfectly happy here in Australia and in New Zealand to do commercial deals with the Russians.
Oh, we're not perfectly happy to accept it. We prevented the Soviet Union getting shore bases in Tasmania.
But Kiribati has prevented them too. They've only said they'll have an offshore fishing agreement.
Yes, but I've said based on past experience in relation to small island states, that inevitably moves towards a military facility.
It's often been said that you're a man of great and surprising contradictions. Those people, for example, who see you as a hardline conservative on superpower politics, for example, are quite confounded when it comes to your radical role in Africa. You're totally opposed to apartheid, and you played a major role in the transition to majority rule in Zimbabwe. I wonder if you're a little disappointed at the way things are turning out in Zimbabwe now.
Well, yes, a little disappointed. But at the same time, I find reporting on the issue in Australia partisan, one-sided, and even mischievous.
In what way?
Only the bad things are reported about Zimbabwe, and there are some things that are not bad. And reporting does not seek to give any of the reasons for what's happening. Doesn't take any account of the fact that Africa and African history is so totally different from Australian history, New Zealand or British history, that the Westminster system is not easily translatable straight away into an African situation.
You're being very tolerant, Mr. Fraser, but when, I mean, this lesson of history, if you like, was apparent when the Lancaster House Constitution was drawn up. Mr. Mugabe does seem to be on the point of tearing up that Constitution now. Do you think that's a reasonable thing for him?
In 1987, or the white seats, the reserved seats, were to endure until 1987.
For the whites?
Yes. Now, quite plainly, any African government would make an attempt to alter the Constitution to abolish those reserved seats. We wouldn't tolerate reserved seats in our parliament for any minority group. And nobody ever believed that that was anything other than a transitional arrangement.
Do you think you knew at the time that they might have jumped the gun a bit?
It was an absolute certainty. Every one of the people at Lancaster House, whether it was Bishop Muzawera, Nkomo, or Mugabe, would talk privately about ultimately establishing a one-party state in Zimbabwe. I don't want, and I'm not an apologist for any move towards a one-party state. But the only point that I do make is that unless people, well, Australians, in our instance, try to understand some of the circumstances of Africa, we're going to make wrong judgments.
Are you a little frustrated, Mr. Fraser, that
Not
you're
at all, no.
no longer at the real cutting edge of these decision-making?
Well, I was fully involved in politics really for 30 years, because fully involved for a couple of years before I first became member for Wylam. I was Prime Minister for over 7 years, the best part of 8 years.
You should think that would be enough for anyone.
Hmm?
You'd think that would be enough for anyone, but you're giving the impression that you're not that keen to let go. You're constantly roaming around the globe, talking to other former leaders, old leaders. You didn't get the scent for politics on your return from New Zealand. I mean, just like old times, wasn't it? Names like Cairns, Morosi, Cook, even Murphy in the headlines.
Well, that's just seeing a Labour government fall apart. That's all. That's only part of that.
What do you think should happen in the case of Justice Lionel Murphy?
I'm very surprised that I haven't seen people writing editorials in defense of the High Court, because there's a very simple principle involved. If there's any breath of scandal attaching to any person, any untoward controversy, that, in my view, makes him unfit to be chosen for or to sit on the High Court. And people used to take the view that if that kind of scandal does attach to them or may attach to them, even though they're innocent, they should resign so that their own problem doesn't become a problem for the institution. And they resign quite simply because they have an enormous regard for the importance of the institution, if you like, as a protector of the ultimate rights of, many ultimate rights anyway, of all Australians.
Are you saying that Justice Murphy is acting selfishly in not resigning?
I think he's acted selfishly, yes, but at the same time, I have to say he's acted, by not resigning, he's acted in a way that many other Australians also would have acted. And I happen to think that's wrong. The old principle was the better one, and I'd like to see it. It was applied in my government, but I wonder if it will ever be applied in another government.
Do you think he should now be able to wait until his appeal is exhausted? What I'm suggesting is that whatever harm might have been done to the office has already been done.
Oh, I think harm can be continuing. The longer the association, the greater the harm. But
what if
you see, let me just follow that through, because if Mr. Justice Murphy appeals and if he's acquitted, in his philosophy and in the philosophy of many people, he presumably stays and is entitled to stay.
You disagree?
Yes, I do. Absolutely.
So even if Justice Murphy is acquitted, he should stand down?
He should have stood down, in my view, before he was committed for trial. Because I do not believe you can have a a judge of the High Court, subject to the kind of public debate and public argument that Mr. Justice Murphy has been subject to. And again, I reiterate, in my view, it is not a question of innocence or guilt. It is a question of maintaining the integrity of the court as one that is totally and absolutely beyond question in terms of integrity and honor and all those things that are important. And if that's to be so, you can't have the court or its members dragged through this kind of dispute.
Is there anything, given that there's such a high principle at stake in your view, is there anything that the government or the opposition can do to precipitate things, to bring matters to a head?
Oh, they both could have.
But now?
I think there's another question here, both for the government and for the opposition. The only way of removing a justice from the High Court is to move resolutions through both houses of Parliament. I haven't given a great deal of thought to whether such a resolution ought to be moved purely on the basis of the principle that I advocate, or whether it would be wrong to make that decision until after the appeal mechanisms have been entirely worked through.
But at some time it should happen, even if he's acquitted, for example.
I believe so, yes, I believe so. But, you know, again, this is the tragedy of a situation in which people have to argue about these things. In older days, people would resign.
Clearly, Mr. Hawke would like to distance himself from some of the ghosts of the Whitlam government, Cairns, Morosi, and I imagine Justice Murphy as well. Do you recognise that the Liberals may feel the same way about you?
Oh, I've got no doubt that some Liberals would feel that way.
It's just that your name doesn't seem to be invoked too often these days, except in criticism of some sort. I mean, John Fowler, the new president the other day, referred to the fact that he said the main root problem in Australia at the moment is that for the last 15 years the unions have dominated the government. Of course, for half that time you were in office.
Yes, and for the first 5 years I was in office, industrial disputes were low and wage claims on average were a little bit less than consumer price index. And I can remember occasions in which private industry was saying, well, you know, don't be too tough on the unions, negotiate with the unions and you'll get to a reasonable result. I've said quite publicly that I think a major mistake I made was accepting that kind of advice and not moving for a constitutional change early in 1976.
In a wider sense, though, I wonder if you feel in some way that your government lost its way. Again, Mr. Valder said that by the end you'd lost not only your principles, but the rhetoric had even been abandoned.
Well, some Liberals have the mistaken view that they advance their own cause by criticising previous Liberal governments. That also, I think, is a modern view. It's not a view, incidentally, that Andrew Peacock shares. Even though he resigned from our cabinet at one point and made some fairly cogent criticisms, as leader of the opposition, Andrew has been loyal to the past. He's not sought to belittle it.
You're aware that you surprised a lot of people when you finally came down on Mr. Peacock's side rather than Mr. Howard.
I didn't take part in that election and didn't come down on anyone. Oh, when I made a statement. Oh, well, that's a question of having seen and observed and watched people in opposition.
I think it's fair to say that Mr. Howard felt perhaps abandoned.
But it's a question of circumstance, you see. If he hadn't restrained his supporters in the previous year, he would have been, I suppose, leader of the opposition. There were one or two occasions when probably he could have been. But Andrew Peacock had done fairly well during that campaign, much better than anyone had expected. He had kept his cool, he'd shown dignity, determination and steadfastness, when maybe those things hadn't been expected. And he'd done it all in the face of enormous criticism. And, you know, people were saying, well, after the election, the Liberals will do so badly that Howard will walk in. And it didn't turn out that way.
You're saying that John Howard, in fact, had his chance and blew it?
Oh, he certainly had it, I suppose, at least twice during that earlier year. But whether he didn't want to get beaten by Mr. Hawke or not, I don't know. Andrew Peacock did well in that campaign and showed a determination, a pragmatism and common sense which earns him the right, in my view, to take the Liberal Party into the next election, which I believe he'll win.
You're saying that he showed some courage. You're suggesting that Mr. Howard, in fact, balked at the prospect of having to take on Mr. Hawke.
I don't know why he didn't put up his hand then. But now, as deputy leader, he has only one duty, and that's to make the current operation, organisation of the Liberal Party, parliamentary party, work effectively.
Is he honouring that duty, do you think?
I'm sure he will be.
Is he now?
I'm sure he will. Yes.
Has he all the time?
I believe so.
Pardon me, but there was a moment of hesitation there.
No. John Howard is a good deputy leader. He was a deputy leader to me. As deputy leader in particular, he has an obligation to make sure that the ship under its captain and vice captain works smoothly and effectively. And under those circumstances, the Liberal Party will win the next election. I've got no doubt about that.
Would he be a good leader as well?
I think there are probably a number of good leaders in the Parliamentary Liberal Party.
I wonder if I could ask you to address yourself to that particular one, though. Do you think he would be a good leader?
Look, we've gone down this track far enough. I don't want to speculate about other leaders when there is a leader, and when that leader is going to be successful.
It's just that by not, specifically not, or refusing the opportunity,
Oh,
I suppose.
no, you're just doing the old business of trying to stay on a point and get me to say something I don't want to say. There is a leader, and I, for one, am not going to speculate about other possible leaders, and I do not believe there will be any challenge to Andrew Peacock this side of the next election.
So the same question that was put to Mr. Valder with some disastrous results the other day. You can't see any circumstances before the next election which could lead to a change of leadership?
No, I can't see those circumstances arising, not at all.
Malcolm Fraser, down on the farm and on some of our leading citizens as well, it seems. My apologies, incidentally, to David Coombe. Fancy getting Curibus right and then somehow mispronouncing Coombe. Anyway, like a lot of other people, of course, Malcolm Fraser doesn't think much of the government's moves against negative gearing and capital gains. Some people say it will have a disastrous effect on the housing market. Already, hundreds of thousands of Australians are struggling to keep a roof over their heads. As Four Corners will report next week.
It's in the older areas of the big cities like Sydney that many people get caught in the housing trap, especially women bringing up children on their own. Sue Zachman has a 5-year-old daughter. Until this week, the two were living in a single-room flat and paying $50 out of Sue's pension for the privilege. Without notice, the rent went up. So Sue Zachman is joining the growing numbers of inner-city squatters.
The way I see it is what's going on is that what I'm doing is perfectly justified. As far as I'm concerned, I think that it's criminal to let houses stand while there are people kind of suffering to the extent that they are by just being totally displaced. There are lots of people who are sleeping in cars, there are people staying at refuges. You don't know what's going to happen from one day to the next.
So in no way at all do you feel a criminal for having broken into here?
No, I feel it's fully justified.
In this case, the house is owned by the Department of Main Roads, the DMR in New South Wales. But in all states, all governments own houses that stand empty. Meanwhile, the waiting list for public housing continues to grow, and thousands of Australian families are at the mercy of the private rental market.
When the roof falls in next Monday night. See you then. Thanks very much for being with us. Good night.